Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So a couple of years ago, when I went to my first in-person presentation, which was Brexis in Amsterdam, I was kind of struck by how often the movie lens dataset was mentioned. And it's still a very current thing. This is a, oh, you can actually cannot really see it, right? Anyway, well, you have to believe me that this is a graph with nice bars of how often the term is mentioned over the years. And you can see, I mean, it's not really increasing anymore, but it's stable. And I think this kind of, I actually also counted it today. There were 4 sessions today that mentioned the movie lens dataset. And I think that kind of shows that the type of data sets that are open source available are pretty important, and they kind of have a shaping factor in the type of research that is being done, which is not weird, right? As an individual researcher, you don't have access to all these like proprietary data sets, and it also helps with making your results contestable, verifiable. However, it does make it extra important that we're kind of aware of what is in these data sets. So at the end of 2020, the MSN News, the MIND dataset was published, which is obviously based on MSN News. And it contained about 1 million user interactions that had occurred with the platform in November 2019, I think, over a period of 2 weeks. And MSN News is completely algorithmically curated. There's no manual involvement in there whatsoever. And what else? And also it's a news aggregator, and it's never actually really clear of what type of content makes it into the system and how they balance certain values like click-through rates, financial gains, but also things like diversity and inclusion. So small example of what an entry in the MIND dataset looks like. What we see here is, well, we have a user at the timestamp as at the system. This person at that point had interactions with these 2 news items, of which one is lifestyle and another one is news. And based on that, this user was shown 2 other items, and one was about football and one about news US. And the person clicked on the last news item. Well, the first news is about something about cartoons, and the next one about gymnasts. So, I mean, I am not a very smart neural recommender, but for me, it would be kind of hard to find patterns in this data. Anyway, I'll skip this one for now. Some statistics about the data set in general. So I did an analysis of the test set, which consists of 370,000 roughly interactions with the system. The users over there had on average 37 items. They will have interacted with a subset of those, and almost half of the user interactions of the unique user IDs in the system only access the system once. But there were quite a big number of people that did return more frequently, almost 2,000 unique IDs. But if you would look at the average time between the first and the last time that they access the system, this would be on average 6 hours and at maximum 24 hours, which means after 24 hours, these people are forgotten. And this makes it hard to do research on news and news diversity. If you cannot track a user for more than a day, you don't really have a good idea of how what they are recommended consumes their media diet. Although at the same time, there can also be good reasons for this, right? There's rules and regulations about GDPR, etc. Again, logical reasons, but it is something that you need to know and need to be aware of. So I'm sorry for spouting you with a giant table, but this is the distribution of item categories of the different parts of the pipeline. On the left, you see what was in the entire data set. The next one was what was in the candidate list. What could a recommender system make its decision from? What was in the user's history? What have they clicked? And what has been selected by the 2 neural recommenders that MIND also include in there? Well, 2 of the recommender systems that MIND includes in their data set. And you can already see quite a big difference when you move from the entire data set to just the candidate selection. For example, the biggest difference is the lifestyle category, which all the items only account for 4.4%. But after candidate selection, there would be more than 17% of these types. And you see the opposite kind of happen with news and sports. Like all the news within MSN News is about 30%, but after candidate selection, it's only 23%. And the same holds for sports with 30 and 16%. And the funny thing is that since these neural recommenders are kind of trained to take a user's reading history into account, you would maybe expect there to be similar patterns there, right? You would expect that the recommender systems have similar patterns in what they recommend compared to what the user has read before. But this is really not the case. What it really reflects, which is also not very surprising, is what users have clicked. And so this kind of leads to questions, right? Why is there such a big difference between what is apparently in this data set recorded in a user's history and what they have clicked? Also here, there could be a lot of decent explanations. We have seen studies that people are more likely to click on negative news or on clickbait that may not, they will click on it, but it may not be really representative of what they want to read. And actually, you can see more interesting patterns when you also take the positioning of items into account. I did not mention that before, but here for the recommendations, I did a cutoff at 8 items and then did not take ordering into account there. So here ordering is taken into account, and then you can also see more profound differences between the different recommender. Is that some? Okay, never mind. Between the recommender systems. And what you see here is that both these items are very likely to recommend news items at the first spot in the recommendation, almost as much, but sports even more so. And this is also important to consider. We've seen more times today that users tend to be, or readers tend to be very prone to position bias. You look maybe at the first, perhaps the second, but a lot of the time not much further. And whereas what we see here is that, oh, what did I do? How do I, what? Under what? If you see here that the finance category is still 6% of the data, 7% in the candidate history, which could be considered quite a big amount of content. It doesn't even show up at all in the top categories of the NRMS recommender system. And another one, it's a bit hard, with all these numbers to really know them from the top of your head. If you see that there's really a disproportionate representation here for items of the article food and drink. It's, in one for ECIR, it is about 10% of all the items recommended are of the category for food and drink. And for NRMS, that's even 15%. Well, maybe at this point in time, there was an amazing new recipe from a very famous cook. But yeah, I think if you want to generalize for your recommender system for news, it's not a very useful thing in there. And in general, one thing that you could consider here is also the granularity of the item categories that are chosen here. So here in the design of this data set, they chose to have separate categories for entertainment, music, movies, and TV, which together account for less than 10% of the data set. In comparison, there is just one big top level category for news. So maybe if you had designed this data set more with hard news in mind, you would have chosen a distinction there between local news, global news, politics, etc. And then it also becomes, it's also, if you take that into account, it's also easier to explain why, for example, the candidate list tends to be a bit skewed towards the smaller categories. Because if you are going to have a proper recommender system that's tailored to users' preferences, that recommender system needs to be able to choose your specific preferences, right? So of course, it's going to inflate the smaller categories in there and deflate the bigger ones. So yeah, another thing to consider when you design your system. One last observation about this is that there is also a big difference in the spread of categories between ECIR and NRMS, because NRMS is very likely in the top positions to also recommend items from the top categories. So I think in the first position, NRMS has about 40% of its content is from the top categories, whereas for ECIR, that's only 73%. And these are also interesting because if you just look at performance metrics, the two algorithms behave fairly similarly. They have pretty similar scores. But if you look at them in more detail, it does turn out that they actually have quite different behavior still, which you don't see if you only focus on the performance metrics. So yeah, in conclusion, the different stage of the pipeline affect the distribution content is different at different stage of the pipeline. This is also not only something that caused by the recommender system. So you cannot say, oh, the recommender system did this. No, it's a sequence of design choices that make the system behave as it does. In general, the patterns reflect reported clicks, not reading history. But also more specifically, if you are interested in diversity and news diversity, there is not all that much that you can do with this data set because there's not a lot of information available. There's the text, there's the publication date and the category. Good luck with that. Because users are forgotten after 24 hours, it's also very hard to see long-term effects of your recommender system. And as I said before, the chosen article, the granularity of the categories is a bit weird. So why do we care about this? In general, you see that this is on the left is the Reuters report of 2022, I think. And you see that people are consistently interacting less with the news, at least a lot less with legacy media such as television, radio, etc. And online news, the social news does make up for it, but not enough. So it doesn't fill the gap left by the legacy media. And people say that this is because they find the news too negative, there's too much, they cannot find their way around it. So in this, news recommender systems could really play a valuable role in getting the right news to the right people. But with that come a lot of discussions about filter bubbles because they are only, right now, usually only optimized on clicks, which if you have more clicks, you will only see that, what you have already seen before, etc. And having a good data set that could actually help promote this type of diversity with long-term effects could also, if you are going to use big words, even for society, have very much beneficial effects. So in general, if you are interested in diversity long-term effects, you would want a data set that has a bit more of a focus on hard news. We've seen in the Mind data set that it's basically 30% news and 70% other. You would want a sufficient number of return. You would not need the sheer scale of the Mind data set. We don't need 1 million users, but we need more quality information about the users that are there and that are more frequent users. And you would want to follow them over a longer period of time so that you can also see how both the recommender and the user and in turn their media diet changes over time. So in conclusion, Mind is, don't get me wrong, Mind is a great step forward if you want to do news recommendation research, but there is still a lot of room left for improvement. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.